Okay.
You know, Pastor said this was going to be the last session on on what we just studied, when
It's
Jesus is coming back.
the end of the end times tonight. Oh, no.
The end times. This is gonna be the end of the end times. So I thought I'd sing this, that Gene and I would sing this song that we've sung for years, but it is truly my dream to be able to sing this song for real one day. And if you know the chorus, if you recognize the chorus, please sing along with us, even if you know some of the verses. And I'm going to surprise you with it, so I'm not going to tell you what it is before I sing it. So, all right? But Gina gets to sing with me, too. You got to get closer to the mic, Gina.
Go ahead, you start.
Kind of homesick for the city to which I've never been before. No sad goodbyes will there be spoken, for time won't matter anymore. Beulah land, I'm longing for you, and someday on thee I'll stand. There my home shall be eternal. Beulah land, sweet Beulah land. So now I'm looking for the river where my faith's gonna end in sight. There's just a few more days to labor. Then I'll take my heavenly flight. Beulah land, I'm longing for you, and someday on thee I'll stand. There my home shall be eternal. Beulah land, sweet Beulah land.
Awesome. Thank you. So good. I feel like I'm so thankful that Fernando and Gina have been willing to do this and to do this on a moment's notice for us. As I feel like the songs that we've sung over the last, it's been a month or so, I guess, that we've been doing this, help us to focus on the important stuff, the things that we really should be getting excited about. We're talking about things that are controversial, and again, I don't want to discourage you from digging deep into these matters, or to have you throw your hands up and go, well, just nobody knows. We should dig in, and we should develop convictions about these things, and at the same time, we need to just not, our passion shouldn't be about the minute parts of this, but should be about the things that are clear. I always have to qualify this whenever I say things like this. I like Alistair Begg as a preacher. I don't agree with everything Alistair Begg says. One of the things that he says is the main things are the plain things, and the plain things are the main things. I find that a helpful thing to go back to. So some of this is really plain and really obvious, and that's where we started. And we are now ending on these three major, could be four, major ways to think about the return of Christ if you adopt a premillennial perspective, okay? And so the return of Christ in relationship to this time of tribulation that Jesus spoke about. There is, if you read through the Olivet Discourse, there is a time of tribulation that Jesus tells us will come. Many associate that with the whole period between Jesus' death and resurrection and his second coming, but also say there is a particular period of intense tribulation at the end. And that's the Great Tribulation is usually how people talk about it. We already discussed that that is a term that we use that is only used once in the Bible, the Great Tribulation. There is talk about a Great Tribulation, Tribulation, but as a term, the Great Tribulation, it's only used once. But we use it to refer to this 7-year period, typically. And so some people think Jesus is coming back in a way that he only comes for his people, pre-tribulation. Okay, that's basically what that means is the rapture. Jesus coming to get his own, the resurrection of those who belong to him, the going up into the air, those who are here and believe in him. That happens before that 7-year period of intense tribulation. Then we said there are people who locate that in the middle of the tribulation. And they say Jesus is going to come for his church, and he's going to come in the middle, right after the setting up of the abomination of desolations. That's one view. Or a little bit broader sort of, frankly, it's kind of vague intentionally to be able to group a larger group of views together. It's a pre-wrath view that, hey, somewhere in there, somewhere in that 7-year period, there is going to be an intensification of the wrath of God. And at that point, that is when Jesus is going to come for his people. Now, in both, or if you're going to call those three views, we'll call them three. In all three of those views, there is a common theological reasoning, and that theological reasoning is that the people of God will not, specifically Christians, will not experience the wrath of God. Therefore, they will be removed from the earth before the fullness of God's wrath is poured out. And so they have, then we looked at the different texts that would support those views. By the way, we are, even though some people are like, feels like we've been doing this forever, like when are we going to change topics? We are actually only scratching the surface, okay? So this is very much an overview of these views. This has not been a detailed approach to each of these. Every single one of these views has supporters that have written lengthy volumes on these views to support them. So if you're really, really interested, then that's kind of the next step. And if you're interested in a particular view and want a book recommendation from me, what I'll be happy to do, even if it's not the view that I hold, is to point you in a direction and say, hey, here is an author that holds that view. If you want to get the best presentation of that view that I know of, that's who you should, that would be a really good place to start. Okay, so again, overview. But we did those two views. The last, or sort of three, if you count the mid as separate from the pre-wrath. The last view that we're going to talk about, and I think we'll wrap up tonight, is what's called the post-tribulation view. It means that the rapture happens post-tribulation. One thing that's important to say with this view is that this view does not necessarily adopt the idea that there is a distinct 7-year period at the end. Okay, so within all of these views, there's a lot of variation, but this is a significant variation for this view. Some say everything that needs to be fulfilled has been fulfilled, and so they would take a preterist view of that first part of the Sermon on the Mount all the way up through the abomination of desolation. They would say that happened in 70 AD. It's done. The only thing we're waiting for is Jesus to come back. That's the next thing on the calendar. And they would say, yes, there are these references in Paul to the man of lawlessness, but we don't get a timetable in Paul. And that's because they don't accept the view of Daniel 9 that puts the 70th week in the future. They take that view that we talked about of Daniel 9 that puts the 70th week as already having happened. Okay? So that's one approach to the tribulation taken by Israel. Other people say, no. The 70th week is still future. There will be a fulfillment of the Olivet Discourse in the future. There will be another abomination of desolation. That is the man of lawlessness. All of those things go together. That's all the same. And they would say what we need to do is we need to adjust our expectation of imminency. So to say that we need to be ready for the return of the Lord does not necessarily mean that he might come in the next 30 seconds. It means that he could come in anybody's lifetime. It means that he could come in any fairly short period of time, but that it's not the imminency of our pre-tribulation view, which the pre-tribulation view, as I told you, I think has they have the most flexibility with imminency because the rapture really could happen at any time in that view. And so the exhortations to be ready at any time make lots and lots of sense in that view. This view, again, either says, yes, we agree, it could come at any time, and there are no other things that have to happen first, or we need to change our way of imminency, our way of thinking about imminency, because the rapture and the second coming are the same event in this view. All right? So let's walk through it and see how we do. Okay, this starts on, if you've held on to the handout, it starts on the bottom of page 17. I have a couple more of these. Okay, maybe, does anybody else need one? Okay, you guys can both have one. Oh, sorry, I can get you one afterwards. You can share? All right. Here you go. Okay. So bottom of page 17, if you're dealing with draft 3.0, all right, it hasn't changed for a while. For a while there, we had new editions every week. It was pretty exciting. All right, so post-tribulation argument. This is an important place where they start. One of the things that this view tends to point out is this is a succinct way to say it. Other tribulation views are possible, but they are not necessary inferences. So they would say, look, those other views, they have to do a lot of exegetical work to try and tell you why, the trumpets that are the last trumpet really isn't the same as the other last trumpet, which really isn't the same as the trumpet that the angel blew in the gathering of God, of the elect, is not the same thing as the gathering of the believers in Christ. So that's a lot of work to try and separate those hairs. That's how they would say it. This is sort of splitting hairs here. Okay? And so while it could be that, if there's a simpler way, then we should go with a simpler way, right? So they're gonna push for Occam's razor. You know who Occam is? I don't. Okay, but I know a lot about his razor. Occam's razor is the idea that you should go with the simplest explanation for something rather than the more complex ones. And so they're going to argue, hey, those views require a lot of complex interpretations, and this view is simpler. So here's a quote from an article that argues this position. Pre-tribulationism maintains that there will be two phases of Christ's coming, or one could even say two comings. There will also be three resurrections. The first will be the resurrection of the righteous at the rapture, for Paul teaches that believers that are alive at the time will not precede those who are dead. Then at the end of the tribulation, there will be a resurrection of those saints who have died during the tribulation. And finally, at the end of the millennium, there will be a resurrection of unbelievers. And they say, boy, that's a lot of stuff. And it's not spelled out in any one passage. You have to go to all these different passages to figure it out. So they're going to say their view is the simple view. Of course, people who don't agree with it don't think it's simple and think it's problematic. But anyways, I'm trying to maintain the argument here. They would also say that people tend to invest too much in that 7-year scheme of Daniel. They would say, look, you're basing your whole eschatology on the 70th week of Daniel, which is one of the most disputed passages in the Old Testament. You generally don't want to, and this is a good rule, you generally don't want to hang your doctrine on passages that are highly disputed, because they're highly disputed. And so that makes it difficult to hold to and to defend. They would argue that the church is present throughout Revelation. They would say, hey, we read about saints in Revelation, and that's the church. And they can point to passages where Christians are clearly referred to as saints. They would also say, when you read the Olivet Discourse, the elect who clearly go through the tribulation, because the tribulation is said to be cut short for their sake, indicating that they're there. Those are not Jews only. Those are anybody who trusts in Jesus. And so they would agree that, yes, of course, throughout the Old Testament, the word elect is used to refer to the Jewish people. But then when you get to the New Testament, we have a lot of talk about election of Christians. And so that's the way that component goes. So they would say the whole idea that there's no church in the book of Revelation or the Olivet Discourse, they would say we would not accept that fact. They would say tribulation and wrath are not the same thing. So while they could be occurring at the same time, it doesn't mean that they're the same. The Bible clearly does expect believers to face tribulation. One of my favorite verses, if you want to just get a little encouragement in the midst of some of these details, John 16:33. These things I have spoken to you so that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation, but take courage, I've overcome the world. So they say, hey, look, the great tribulation, if they accept the premise that there is a great tribulation at the very end, they would say, Christians go through tribulation all the time. In fact, Paul makes clear that to the church in Ephesus that you have to go through lots of tribulation before you enter into the kingdom. So I'm now on page 18, that's Roman numeral 4 And there are numerous verses listed there that talk about Christians in tribulation. They would also say, we dispute the idea that the day of the Lord is exclusively about wrath. They would say, yes, it has to do with wrath, but we don't accept the idea that the day of the Lord is only wrath. It is great blessing for those who are awaiting God to come and to intervene. And so we don't need to read it only as wrath. What is wrath for one group of people is salvation for another. You'll hear people in this camp oftentimes referring back to the Exodus, right? And they'll say, think about the plagues in the Exodus. God's people were there. They were spared from many of the effects of the plagues. And so as God poured out his wrath on Egypt, he was also simultaneously saving his own people. And so we don't have to say that these things are mutually exclusive. And there's a couple quotes there and some references. Joel 2 in particular, the day of the Lord contains elements of wrath and deliverance. That's the passage I would go to make that argument. And then they would say Christians can be present when God pours out his wrath. They would go to places like Revelation 3:10, which we mentioned. Even a lot of pre-tribulation people would say it's not the best for their position. They would prefer the verses in 1 Thessalonians we looked at. But they would say, hey, look, Revelation 3:10, because you have kept the word of my perseverance, I will also keep you from the hour of testing, that hour which is about to come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth. So remember last week we used that as an argument to say Christians won't be present when the hour of testing, the time of tribulation comes when wrath is poured out. And then they would say, but hey, here's a neat fact. The same word is used in John 17:15, which says, this is Jesus praying, I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. And they would say, hey, look at that. Jesus is actually specifically praying that they not be taken out of the world, simply that they be kept. Being kept doesn't mean being taken out of the world. Being kept just means God protecting you, like he protected the Israelites in the Exodus story. The next, let's pause there. Any thoughts, comments, questions, concerns? Yes.
It specifically says keep them from the evil one. It didn't say keep them from God's wrath.
Yeah, okay, good. So a good pushback on that is to say one is being kept from a person, and one is being kept from from something not so personal, and it seems like maybe they need to just be out of this space. The pushback is you'll notice that the evil one is in italics. These are from the NASB. The NASB, when a word is in italics, it means that they have supplied it to try and help make more sense. It's not actually there in the Greek text. And so they would say, actually, John 17:15 could be read as just keep them from evil. And you've heard this in the Lord's Prayer. Is it deliver us from evil or is it deliver us from the evil one? And it has to do with Greek grammar, and it could go either way. So, but great observation. That is a good way to push back on this. Yes.
But would you describe God's wrath as evil?
I would not. It would be righteous. So they're not saying that these are talking about the same thing. Though what they're saying is the word usage. To be kept from something doesn't mean to be necessarily kept away from it, but it can mean to just be to persevere in it. That's the main comparison that they're making. Yes.
I recall that after the desolation, Christians are hunted down and beheaded.
Okay.
That's not being kept from.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Great pushback. Right. So we get this and we say okay because they're going to say of the innumerable multitude that comes out of the tribulation. This view is saying Well, they were in the tribulation if they came out of the tribulation. And a good pushback on that is say, well, if that's how you read it, it doesn't sound like God is really keeping them because they're dying. So,
5:9 says we're not destined for wrath.
right. Yeah. So, and then I think the question becomes, is dying or being killed necessarily facing God's wrath? And at least in some cases, we would say no. Maybe in the tribulation, because all the bad things that are happening are directly connected to God's activity, the answer is yes. But like today, if we see a Christian, right, some of these awful videos that get posted of somebody beheaded by ISIS, they are not being kept the way we would like to see them being kept, but are they facing the wrath of God? I don't think in that example I just gave, I don't think they are. So I think that's how the argument I think that's how they would push back. Yeah.
It all depends on how we look at death. If we look at death as something horrible, then they're not being kept from God. But if we look at death as Paul did, for me to live as Christ and to die as gain.
Yeah.
So we often think of death as something horrible, but death is not horrible for believers.
Yep.
So to be kept from God's wrath, we're not, because we're in heaven. The wrath of God will never, ever fall on it. We'll never set foot in hell. We'll never be judged in the place of wailing and gnashing of teeth and that
Yeah.
kind of stuff.
Right.
And that means, so, I mean, I don't think we we need to look at death as something horrible. Or even the way, when I look at those Christians who die that are drowned in the thing or beheaded or burned or anything, I don't look at that as, for them, you know, I look at, for them, it's a deliverance.
Yeah.
Because they are no longer having to undergo persecution.
Yeah.
They are with God.
Yeah.
And that is fantastic. That is wonderful. And their testimony is amazing.
Right.
Because here they are dying for Christ, actually living for Christ, and they're trusting that promise. That's not God's wrath.
Okay.
That's-
Okay. So there's some good thoughts there. Tim and then Mike.
Okay, if you look at Fox's Book of Martyrs, it's a plethora of Christians that are killed for their beliefs. And there are numerous places in there where people are burned at the stake. I'm thinking of a particular example. And two of his brothers were with him the night before, and they're talking to him, and they said, hey, listen, you know, you're gonna die tomorrow. Let us know if God is there with you. If he is, his hands were not manacled. Raise your hands and clap them. They're watching him burned at the stake, and he raised his hands and did this. Now, I take that as a promise from God that he will be with us in such a way that it will be okay.
So I think let's take a quick break from how this applies to, because I think that gets us, you know, if we're locked into our view, we could be viewing this only as an attack and just say, I think that is true, right? God, if you've been with believers when they die, God gives a grace in that moment that is really spectacular. And many people who have died even very painful deaths seem to be experiencing God's presence and grace in a way that they never had before. And so that may not be, from an eternal perspective, a bad thing. But in the short term, if we jump back here, we can say it doesn't really seem like he's keeping them. And so that's the discussion as it relates to the end times. Good. I don't know if that's going to be a clincher either way, right? Okay, Mike, and then Ken, right? Okay.
When you had, we were talking about the plagues in Egypt. And that the Israelites went through most of the plagues. Thing is, Scripture says when God kept them from those plagues, it's very, very specific about, you know, they didn't have this happen or that happen to them. In Revelation, it does not give specific specifics about them being kept.
Okay, good.
Just the verbiage, they're being,
Yeah.
3:10.
Yeah, so so you're making a good point. In the plagues of Egypt, there are, the land of Goshen is oftentimes specified as like, all the plagues hit there, but didn't hit there. Or we're specifically told the Israelites didn't suffer this. We're actually not told that on all of the plagues too, so they may have been affected by some of them. Usually the most intense ones, they seem to be protected. So your pushback is to say it's spelled out in Exodus. Why don't we see it spelled out in Revelation if that's what's happening? And basically what you're saying is these guys are making an inference, and it's not an exegetical point where you can say here's the text that says it. It's well, God could do it this way. It's hypothetical. Yeah, good point.
Well, they weren't protected unless they followed the instructions carefully and covered.
Well, that's true. The last plague, the protection had to do with very specific actions. Yes, Ken.
Well, in the beginning, it said Adam and Eve, when they ate the fruit and went against God's word, and he threw them out of Eden.
Mm-hmm.
And he put them on earth, and he said, that would be controlled by Satan. This
yeah.
is Satan's land, not God. He would watch over us.
Okay.
But so therefore, his protection is from Satan. And we're not getting any wrath of God. We're feeling the wrath of Satan that's actually doing it throughout the whole history of the Bible.
Yeah.
And,
I certainly think that, right. So the case, Jesus talks about the prince of this world, the prince of this age. And so even today, Christians do suffer, but we are not under God's wrath. So this is an important point. It's an important point, one, for theology today, to just say just because you're suffering doesn't mean that God is punishing you. That's a clear point, and everybody should be able to agree on that one. And then people who take this perspective would extend that. First Thessalonians chapter 4. Okay, 17. And this is the verse. Remember, all of these views, and really anybody who claims amillennialism or postmillennialism and says they believe the Bible still has to fit these things into their view. Amillennialism doesn't have a problem with that. Postmillennialism. Right? This is after there is the shout and the archangel with the trumpet of God. The dead will rise first, and then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds and meet the Lord in the air. And so we shall always be. These words. Yes.
And the post-trib people are presuming this is a coming,
It's a.
that it's a coming.
That's right. So
And
they.
he doesn't say he's coming,
Okay.
he's doing a drive-by.
He's doing a drive. Okay. Yeah. This is there's no touchdown at this point, right? No feet planted on the earth here yet. And so far in this reading, your poster friends would agree. Jesus has not touched down yet, but he's about to. Okay? And so what they would say is, look, this word to go and to meet the Lord, is a word that might really be better translated by the English word receive. Like you go out of your house and receive someone who pulls into your driveway, and then you return to where you came from. You take them, you go back with them into your house. And that is indeed a common use, and the only other places where the word is used in the New Testament, that is how it's used. Okay, if you want to look at them, in Matthew 5, I'm sorry. 5. That's not right. Okay, I gotta look this up. I mistyped it. Go to Acts though.
Matthew 25:7.
Okay, not Matthew.
25:26. 5:26.
25 verse 6. Matthew 25 verse 6, sorry. At midnight, at midnight there was a shout, behold the bridegroom, and come out to meet him. Sorry. But in this parable, if you get track of that, the paper says Matthew 5:26, that's wrong. It's Matthew 25 verse 6. It's the parable of the 10 virgins. And they are coming out to meet the bridegroom, and then they're going to go back with the bridegroom, right? They're not going to go stay with him. They're then going to travel with him to where he's going. So they're waiting at the city. They go out of the city, presumably, and then go back in or into the house or wherever the festival's going to be. The more clear example is the one in Acts. Okay, Acts chapter 28. A lot of bouncing around, sorry. Acts 28, verse 15. Okay? So this is Paul coming to Rome. And the brethren, when they heard about us, came from there as far as the market of Appius and the 3 inns to meet us. Same word. And when Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. They did not stay at Appius or the 3 inns. They went out, met him there, received him, and returned with him to Rome. So they left Rome, went out, met Paul, and returned with him. That is the normal meaning of this word. So the Post Tribulationists are going to capitalize on this.
Peter and John about to go into the temple.
Reading for us.
Fixed his gaze on him and said, but he began to give them his attention, expecting to receive
That's
something
all right.
from them.
I'll give you let's take a quick commercial break. Listening to your Bible on audio is a great idea. Really, really. It just doesn't want to listen. Or it wants you to listen. So, hey, I tell you that Jessica and I have been doing this, and I say this to just encourage you because it sounds like you could never do it. You can, if you'll listen to the Bible for about a half an hour a day, you get through the Bible in 90 days. So I decided in January I was going to do it, and I'll be on 4 times through listening. So you gotta try not to be distracted. That's the challenge. But it's different perspective. You really get big, because we tend to kind of I'm gonna read a couple verses. You don't get context that way. When you listen for a half an hour, you're gonna get through Genesis in 3 sittings. You're gonna get through the Gospel of Mark in 1 day. You're gonna listen to whole books at a time. It's fantastic. So, how about Matthew? It's a good change of pace from your pastor's pace. Okay? He was slow, as my grandfather would say, slower than cold molasses. Now, okay, so in Acts 28, the point is, people are leaving Rome to meet Paul, to receive him, and to come back. And so, because a lot of people say, what is the point of the rapture? All you do is fly up there for, who knows, 5 minutes, and come back down. Like, that doesn't sound like a really good trip. You pay a lot of money to go to space for 5 minutes. Okay. But the point is, they would say, well, that's a common use of this word. It means to go out and to receive someone, and then to come back. And so they would agree, Jesus hasn't touched down yet, we're going to go meet him up there, and then we're all going to come touch down together pretty shortly thereafter. Whereas, again, the pre-trib and the mid-trib view is, they go up, they meet the Lord in the air, and then they stay with him, protected, that's how they're kept, while the wrath of God is poured out for however long it is, depending on the perspective. Okay? So, believers return, now going on to page 19. They say, hey, remember those passages that I assigned you to read? 1 Thessalonians 4, and they would say, it sounds to us a lot like 1 Corinthians 15. So if you go to 1 Corinthians 15, verses 50 to 53. Hopefully I wrote the right numbers. Okay? But I say this, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For this perishable must put on the imperishable, and this mortal must put on immortality. And so what they're going to say is, look, these sound like the same thing, which sound like the same thing in the Olivet Discourse, when there's the trumpet and everybody's gathered, and the elect are gathered to Christ. And this is key to their argument. Again, you're introducing unnecessary complexity. These things all sound like the same. They all have trumpets. They've got people rising from the dead, and they've got people meeting up with Christ. Why would we say these are not the same? Okay? Both speak about a resurrection, both speak about trumpets, angels, clouds, gathering of believers. It's all there. There was a time, this is not common anymore, when people who were pre-tribulationists would argue that certain terms always referred to either the rapture or the second coming. I've not heard anybody argue that way in a long time. But this view would point out there's three main words that are used. One is the parousia, a word commonly used of someone important, a dignitary coming to visit a city. This is used of Christ's return. And they would say it's used in the sense of a post-tribulation sense, and it's used to speak of our hope together. And so you can't say the parousia only refers to the rapture or only refers to the second coming. They say it's used for both. Apocalypsis is another word. It's the revealing or the revelation. Okay? And this is why, like the book of Revelation is called the Apocalypse sometimes. This is its name in Greek. It's used of Christ's return after tribulation. And it's also used in a hopeful sense in other places. And then epiphania is another word that is used, like epiphany. This is the arrival of Christ, again used of post-tribulation instances and of future hope. They would say that if you keep reading in 1 Thessalonians 5, and this also they would say works with Luke 12, they encourage you to watch the sky for a post-tribulational coming of the Lord. Let's go back to 1 Thessalonians, because it's such a key passage. So remember, the pre-tribulation view says 1 Thessalonians 4 is about the rapture. 1 Thessalonians 5 is about the second coming. And they would say, wait a minute. Read through 1 Thessalonians 5. Now, as to the times and epochs, brethren, you have no need of anything to be written to you. For you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. When they're saying peace and safety, then destruction will come upon them suddenly like labor pains upon a woman with child. They will not escape. But you, brethren, who are not in darkness, that day would overtake you like a thief. Sorry, you, brethren, who are not in darkness, that day would overtake you like a thief, for you are all sons of the day. We are not of the night, nor of darkness, so let us not sleep, as others do, but let us be alert. So they would say, hey, look, what Paul is saying is, you're going to be there. You need to be alert. The whole point is of Paul's exhortation here is, don't be like those foolish people who are surprised. You're going to be there, and so you be vigilant and you keep watch. For those who sleep, either sleeping at night, they get drunk. Those who get drunk at night. But since we are of the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, the helmet and hope of salvation. For God has not destined us for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through the Lord Jesus Christ, who died, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we will be together with him. Therefore encourage one another and build up one another, just as you're doing. So you see, it's an interesting contrast, these two different readings. One reading says, you won't be there for it, because you're not going to be, there's going to be no wrath. Whereas the post-trib view would say, but wait, the larger context says, you need to be alert. Don't be like those people that are drunk. Don't be like those people who are asleep, because the day of the Lord shouldn't surprise you. Implication, you'll be there when the day of the Lord happens. Okay? So, pre-tribulationists agree with this for Luke 24. Yeah, don't worry about that. We're not we gotta wrap it up. Second coming is imminent because necessary events could occur quickly without our notice, or remember, they would say it's imminent because there's nothing else that we know of in terms of a timetable that is going to happen. They would say the blessed hope of the Christian is confidence that the Lord will protect and keep believers, not necessarily that he will rapture them out. Okay, some of you have to go, and that's fine. But we could hang out for a couple more minutes. I don't want to keep drawing this out. I think we've got it. You get the ideas. Does anybody have remember, this is the broad outline. Anybody want to throw out a couple comments or questions? Wrap it up.
I want to know your view.
You want to know my view? We gotta go, Nancy. Sorry.
I'm not going to go swim until I
You
find out.
told us. Okay. All right. So I'll tell you my story really quick, and that will tell you my view. I grew up with the pre-mill, pre-trib view. And while I was in college, I had to write a paper on the eschatological significance of trumpets. It was exciting for me. And when I did that, at that point, felt like I could not distinguish between these different events that all have the trumpet and Jesus gathering his people to himself. And so but I didn't know that there were other premillennial positions. And so at that point I started going, well, maybe I need to, nobody's a postmillennialist, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Maybe I need to look at amillennialism, which I ultimately didn't find convincing. And then I asked, is there any other way to reason these things? And ultimately became convinced of the post-tribulation position. I hold it loosely. I theoretically, somebody could change my mind on it. Because I think there are some challenges to it, but I think it is, to apply that Occam's razor idea, I think it's the simplest explanation. And so that's the view that I am currently holding. Influence is important. Who's influenced you along the way? A lot of people, you're shaped by the people who teach you. Which is one of the reasons why I've tried to teach this in a way that it exposes you to these different views without being like, well, this is Pastor Jesse's view, so it must be right. Because I don't want you to choose it because of that. But I was ultimately influenced by my New Testament professor, who gave me some books to read on that. It's a view that was revived by a professor. He was at Fuller. His name is George Eldon Ladd. I found his books compelling. Okay, so I loosely hold that view. You had a question or comment?
Well, but can't the mid-trib and the post-trib be able, you can date the rapture then?
Yeah, I
It
think that's
clearly
the,
says you can't date it.
yeah.
Now, where does it say that?
No, it says it doesn't
say
know the
that.
No, it
time.
says you can't know the day or the time.
At that particular time, Jesus said, no one knows that day or time except the Father. He doesn't say we wouldn't know ahead of time. He merely says at that particular point in time, it was restricted. That's what it says.
I would agree with you that that's the biggest problem for the mid and the post-trib views is that, so I know where you're coming from, Tim. But I do think that's a legitimate challenge to say, but wait a minute, we don't know, and will you be able to calculate this? So that drives us back to Daniel 9, and how are we gonna handle Daniel 9?
Yeah, because
How are
they
you
threw
gonna-
out the 70th.
That's where you get the 70th week, and all the time patterns come from that. So, yeah, I think that's the strongest pushback, frankly, against the post-trib view and the mid-trib and the pre-wrath view is, wait a minute, that seems to detract from imminency in a pretty big way. Yep. So where I'm at is the problems, I don't think any of these views are without problem, so I sort of am going, okay, I've got to accept the problem somewhere and try and keep working it. Not done, I could be convinced otherwise. Okay? All right, let me pray for us. Father, I come to you, I thank you for your word. I thank you for your truth. I pray that we would be led into truth. I pray that we would hold our views loosely enough that we can have our minds changed by your word and your leading. And I pray that for me as much as for anybody else, Lord. Lead us into your truth. Give us understanding, Father. And Lord, help us also to maintain unity over these issues. I pray that we would not lose that precious unity and that we would not lose sight of the things that are clear, the hope of our returning Lord and the joy that we will have when